Okay. Now that we've spoken about the works of Shabbat and the origin, and we realize that the list is not biblical. The list is not biblical. It's a rabbinical list that was created in order to facilitate for people the knowledge of what is forbidden, what is permitted on Shabbat. But it's sort of like ballooned, got out of control at a certain point. But let's go back now to the beginning of Masechet Shabbat, and we'll look at the Mishnayot, an interesting thing. The first Mishnah, יציאות השבת, שתיים שהן ארבע בפנים, ושתיים שהן ארבע בחוץ. The first Mishnah says that there are four categories of carrying, or four situations of carrying in and carrying out on Shabbat. Now, this works with the last melacha. The last one on the list is Otzah Mereshut Lereshut. It's number 39. Yet Masechet Shabbat opens with this one, and then the first 6 chapters mostly speak about this melacha of carrying out to the public property, and then a couple of other chapters after the list, and there's a whole other tractate, Masechet Eruvim, that deals with it. And like we said previously, when you have so many details about one halacha, it means that it was a late introduction. Because if it was something that came like halacha le Moshe Sinai, it came all the way down traditionally from Sinai, people would know exactly what to do. But they go into so many details because that was a later introduction. Where did it start from? The halacha of not carrying from one property to another is based on the pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Usually we don't learn halacha from Yirmiyahu, from the Nevi'im. It says, Lo totziu masami batechem beyom HaShabbat. But before that we have nothing. The Torah doesn't say anything about carrying within the public property or private property, or even the definitions of what they are. So,
some people, they don't accept
Eruv, right. So let's speak a little bit about Eruv before we go into the halacha of the Mishnah. Now, not with all the sources, just generally. So like I said yesterday, there are two main categories that are called domains on Shabbat. Reshut HaRabim, Reshut HaYachid. The public property, the public domain, and the private domain. The rabbi said that the idea of the public domain is derived, if we want to know what are the characteristics of the Reshut HaRabim, of the public domain, we learn it from the journey of Bnei Israel in the desert, because that was the first time where they were commanded to observe Shabbat. So how many people were traveling in the desert? 600,000. Remember that's men. There were more adults, there were women, there were children. If we cut them all together, we probably get to 2 million. Even if we said that each one had a wife and a child, that brings it close to 2 million people. So 2 million people is a lot of people, but everybody sticks with the number of 600,000. That's another story, yeah. That's another story. So let's assume there are 600,000, that's the number to make a public domain public. That's public, 600,000. They also said it has to be wide. She'erahav tetzayin amot. It have 16 feet wide. Now, the difference between the desert of back then and any public domain that you look at it today would be that the passage in the desert was a one-time event, even if it took 40 years, but it happened once. You go now to the desert, you don't see people travel by the hundreds of thousands there. And when we speak about public domain, it's a place where people travel regularly. And by the definition of halacha, today the desert would not be considered the public domain. So, but that is how the rabbis define the public domain. It has to have two characteristics. It has to have roads that are 16 feet wide, and through these roads, 600,000 people should travel daily. The private domain is all which is not public. Your house, a courtyard, a small street, all or a dead end. All these are private domains. Only sometimes you'll have a situation where the public domain spills into the private domain. What do you do with a dead end or a cul-de-sac that is next to a major thoroughfare? So those are elements that are discussed in the Mishnah and the Gemara. Then the rabbis introduced a third domain that we could call it the buffer between the two, or the twilight zone between the two, where it's not exactly private property, but it's not public property either. It's a place where it doesn't belong to anyone. People sometimes travel there, but it's random, and you don't have that number of people. So, for example, they give the desert, forests, mountains, the beach. All these places are called Carmelit. Now, with time, the rabbis, there are different qualifications that the rabbis added that actually makes it difficult to find a place that's called public property. So now, if you don't have public property, all the laws that we have in the Mishnah are about carrying from the private into the public and public into private. But there's no problem to go through the buffer zone. So technically, if you pass from private to Carmelit, which is the twilight zone, to the public domain, there's no problem. But the rabbis said, just for that, we want you to make a reminder. It's important for us to understand the concept of Eruv. So again, I'll say that. To carry from the private to the public and vice versa, the rabbi said is forbidden biblically. And in order if you want to override that, you have to build something that's called Surat HaPetah, something that looks like a door. It has to have a vertical beam on top and two doorposts. And you have to do it every 4 feet. So it's not just a string. It's something that really looks like a wall. Now, by biblical standards, it's okay to carry from the private domain to the buffer zone, which is called Carmelit, and back, and the same from the buffer zone to the public domain and back. So technically, you could carry from the private to the public domain if you pass through a buffer zone, right? So the rabbi said that you could do that, but we want you to make a reminder, so you recognize that you don't carry freely. So for that, they said that for this, enough to put a string around it. That's the origin of the Eruv that we have today. That it only helps for a place that it's not a fully public property. Now, the classic distinction in later literature will go all the way to the time of the Shulchan Aruch. It seems that this is how it's placed. The Ashkenazi rabbis said that in order for a place to be called public property, it must have both conditions. It must be both wide, 16 feet wide, and have traffic of 600,000 people. And that was very uncommon back then. And they said we don't have any place that is called public property today, and therefore we don't need the solid door to mark it off, but rather a string is enough. Rabbi Yosef Karo in the Shulchan Aruch says that one of the conditions is sufficient. If you only have 600,000 people, or you only have 16 feet wide streets, any of them is enough to make a place public property, and therefore a string will not be sufficient, and you need to build doors around the place. So a lot of Sephardim, and especially in modern day Israel, people said, "Oh, we follow the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and according to him, that we have public domain and we cannot use a string and we cannot rely on the Eruv." And some of the Sephardim who live in Brooklyn say the same thing, and they decided that they're not going to rely on Eruv because the string is not enough to make it private property. However, Rabbi Yosef Karo, remember that we discussed that when we studied the methodology of Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo had this attitude of leaving things open-ended, making one statement in one place and a different statement in another place, or giving several opinions. So first of all, even when he speaks about the Eruv in the Shulchan Aruch, he gives the two opinions. Some say that you need both conditions to make it public property. Some say that one condition is enough. But in his commentary to the two, the famous Bet Yosef, when he speaks about carrying on Shabbat, he says, "Beyamenu en reshut harabim." In our time and age, there's no such thing as public property. So, since in his time there were roads that were 16 feet wide, and he traveled a lot. You can't say, oh, he grew up in a little, maybe in Tzefat. If you go to Tzefat, I doubt it that in Tzefat even today, in the old city, you would have 16 feet wide streets. But Rabbi Yosef Karo traveled widely. His family moved from Spain to Portugal and then to the Balkans. He traveled. He went to Italy. He saw places. He was in cities where there were wide enough streets. Yet he says there's no such thing today. So it seems that he suggests that for him the real halacha is that you need both conditions to make it reshut harabim. Still today, people would argue that in certain places you would find situations like that. So, for example, in New York, right? You'll have cities, you have streets where 600,000 people drive through daily. But here come all kind of qualifications that the rabbi made that make it almost impossible to have a reshut harabim. One is, and that is the opinion of Haim Ovadia Yosef as well, that when you say that 600,000 people have to travel through the place to make it reshut harabim, to make it a public domain, it has to be foot traffic and not cars. Because when people sit in cars, the car is its own domain. It's a separate entity, exactly. Just like we saw in the Gemara in Shabbat, when they spoke about the agalot, they called the wagons on which they carried the poles, the planks of the Mishkan, they called it Reshut HaYachid, private property. So if it's private property, it's even though 600,000 people go with the cars through a certain, let's say, Fifth Avenue or Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn, and those major thoroughfares, you still don't have the amount of people necessary to make it public domain. That's one thing. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who also was in favor, later on he admitted it was in favor of having Eruv in Brooklyn, but he opposed it for a different reason. I'll say why. He said that from a technical point of view, the city of New York doesn't have any street that is called public property, because he said in order for a street to be a thoroughfare, it has to be straight. No turns, no curves. Wait, don't make a face. Someone make a face, you say it looks strange. So wait, what?
Broadway on Sundays.
Broadway splits. Broadway splits at the Avenue of the Americas. Yes.
Fifth Avenue.
Yeah. All of them at a certain point split, turn. There's an angle. Wait, I know it sounds strange, and Rahamim Bar Makhluf here is making a face like, what is going on? So, but the point is, this is what I'm going at, that when the rabbis find so many ways to bypass the halacha, it means that they know that it's really not forbidden. That's the point. Because otherwise, they're not going to override the halacha. They will try to make it as impossible as they can. So, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says this: it has to be straight. Both of them probably were aware of a statement that was made in the Talmud that by Resh Lakish, Rabbi Shimon bar Lakish is of the first generation of Amoraim, 3rd century. So that goes back almost 1700 years. And he says the following: in order for a place to be called public domain, it has to be completely flat, no inclines. Why? He says he takes it from the pasuk. When Mashiach comes, the whole world will be flattened. Probably it's over there. It's said metaphorically, but now we have to ask about Resh Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. How can you take it to such an extreme when you say that you have to have completely flat terrain to make it reshut harabim, to make it public property? That's it. There will be no place called public property.
Is there a length of that flatness, or is it the entire?
It has to be wide enough for 600,000 people to pass through it, and it has to be flat. So maybe for you in Chile, Tierra del Fuego, is that what you're thinking of, right? So the question that we have to ask is why the rabbis are so lenient, starting with the Resh Lakish, that goes all the way back to Talmudic times, who says that this is okay. I mean, there's no public property today. The answer would be this: since the list is rabbinical and not biblical, the melacha of hotza'ah mereshut lereshut was instituted by the rabbis. There was a whole system that the rabbis created based on maybe a tradition that they have of limiting yourself and carrying or not carrying on Shabbat. That in turn went all the way back to the prophets, Yirmiyahu in the 7th century before the Common Era, and then Nehemiah, who was fighting against the merchants who brought merchandise to Yerushalayim. What they saw was that people since there was no prohibition against carrying on Shabbat, and since most of what people did besides agriculture was commerce, so they would bring merchandise and pass it. The Torah says nothing about selling and buying on Shabbat either. So the rabbis created a system to limit commercial activity on Shabbat, and the main axis around which it revolved was carrying. If you cannot carry from the public property to the private property and vice versa, you cannot conduct any commercial activity on Shabbat. That's why when the rabbis speak in the Talmud about the prohibition of carrying into the city, they use the term Seratia uplatia. I mentioned it before. Seratia is the strata, which means highway. Platia is plaza, the marketplace. So they say that we don't want people to carry through the highway into the marketplace and make it into a bazaar, a market day. And then they added also the prohibition is called muktzeh, that you cannot move certain objects on Shabbat, and said that you cannot touch money on Shabbat. So now, because of the rabbinical decree, it becomes more difficult to conduct business on Shabbat, and you add to that the melacha of writing. You can write down, since you cannot write on Shabbat, so you can't sell with credit and collect the money after Shabbat. They were able to really bring to an end the whole practice of doing commercial activity on Shabbat. That was majorly a rabbinical undertaking, and it became successful, so successful that by the time of Resh Lakish, he felt that there's a need to tone down all the prohibitions about carrying because it's too much. So that's why he said there's no public property today. And probably that knowledge was preserved throughout the ages and brought to the qualifications that the rabbi said that you need both conditions to make it Reshut HaRabim, and that it has to be flat terrain, that the road cannot curve, that people in wagons or in cars are not counted as passengers, etc. So the most extreme view, we could call it lenient, but I think it's strict. We spoke about that everything has a flip side, and I'll tell you where the flip side is. People think that they're strict when they don't rely on the Eruv on Shabbat. I heard it more than once. Someone tells me, I'm mahmi, I don't want to rely on the Eruv. I know there's a string, but I don't want to carry on Shabbat. I'm strict. So what happens because of this stringency? Rabbi Menashe Klein, who is from Hungarian origin, it was originally from Ungvar, and he wrote many halachot, many books of halachot. He's a posek for the Hasidic community. Writes the following: he says, a Hasidic woman came to him, and she said that she decided not to have any more children. He asked her why. She said because she's trapped at home on Shabbat. Because she can't, with the baby, she can't go out. She can't go with a stroller. And he was shocked, and he wrote to all the all of his followers in his book, in his halachic writings, he says, you see what happens because of that stringency? Here's the flip side. People decide not to have children. But even before that, people feel trapped at home. People feel like they're prisoners. People sometimes get stuck when they travel and they get to the airport last minute before Shabbat. They don't go out because they don't know how the things that they're carrying. What are they going to do with them? All this unnecessary suffering because people are strict. Or, as happened to me once in Brooklyn, I saw a couple walking. I guess the husband was mahmir, right? He was strict. He wouldn't carry on Shabbat, but he let his wife carry. So he says, I'm mahmir. You could do whatever you want. So they went for a walk with their kid, 2-3-year-old. She ended up carrying the kid in one hand, his tricycle in the other hand, and he walks. Okay, good. That's not mahmir. That's mekel. That's being lenient. That's allowing yourself to make other people suffer, to make yourself suffer, etc. The most extreme opinion on the other side, which I try to call strict, is that of Rabbi Yosef Messas. Rabbi Yosef Messas in the 50s wrote a letter saying that since Rabbi Yosef Karo said that there's no Reshut HaRabim B'Yameinu, says there's no public property today, right? Good. Says if there's no public property, there's no buffer zone either, because the whole idea of the buffer zone of the Carmelit was to create some kind of a leeway or a twilight zone between the public domain and the private domain. So he says, okay, remove the public domain, put it aside, and now remove the buffer zone and put it aside. What do you have? What do you have left? Private domain. He says the whole world is private domain. You don't need any Eruv at all. He says not only that you could just put a string around the city and call it Eruv, he says you don't need Eruv at all. You could carry freely on Shabbat.
So not just theoretically, so if there is no Eruv on Shabbat, it's okay, we can carry.
That's what Rabbi Yosef Messas says, right? And I think I mentioned it in the past. He got a letter from Rabbi Verdugo in Meknes. He says, I have heard you say that that's the halacha. Verdugo means the one who seeks truth, right? And he said, I heard that you say that. How can you say that? It's a minority opinion. Da'at Yahid. Rabbi Messas answered, join me, and it won't be Da'at Yahid. Like we have it, will become the majority. He says, I see what people are going through. And today, for the Orthodox community, it's a major hassle and a very, very expensive one. Because you have to maintain the place, you have to, when there's a storm, people don't know whether they can go out, don't go out. I tell people this, if you don't want to go with the opinion of Rabbi Messas, and you want to live in a place where there's a Eruv, fine. But you should know that where there's an emergency, you could rely on him. So, for example, if you travel and you're in a place where there's no Eruv, or when there's let's say there was a storm overnight, and people would say, well, okay, I don't know, should I go to the synagogue Shabbat morning or not? Go, don't worry. Or in places I were in some synagogues where people would get alerts just before Shabbat. They would call their Eruv line to know if the Eruv is up or not. He says, don't do that. You know, as long as there's an Eruv in the city, you could go with the assumption that it's still there. Okay, so, Baruch Adonai, Le'olam, Amen.